camp and the youth mission trip that's coming up. You know, again, we leave July 8th, but if you would, probably start praying for all of us now because mission trip or camp is a very impactful time. I know it's impactful for myself and Aubrey and Angie and Tracy as we lead, but also for the students that go. And it's amazing the not just what they learn, and they want to go to camps in which they always serve. And so it's not just cool to see how they serve people. It's cool to see how they grow together as a youth group. You know, if you come to Refuge on a Sunday night, you'll have a mix of students, different ages, tend to stick together, and they know each other from church, but they don't really go to school together, right? A few of them do. But when we go to camp, right, all of a sudden it's them and then other groups, right? So all of a sudden that closeness clicks together, and they become very close that way. And then also, there's just those times, and it happens pretty much almost for like every student, where just throughout the course of the camp, at some point, you can just see their eyes just kind of open. And what I mean by that is, I love this example from Aubrey in the last camp. Me and him were, I think it was in the morning, and we were just talking and at a table, and Chloe happened to walk by. And of course, teenagers don't open up a lot, they don't talk a lot, right? And Aubrey, in his very Aubrey way, you know, he just said, you know, Chloe said something about, like, have you seen Briley or Elizabeth, whatever. And Aubrey said, you know, Chloe, when I see you, I see, and then he just kind of listed out some things about it. And it was cool because you could just tell, like, it affected Chloe, and she just kind of like stopped for a bit, and she's like, well, what do you mean? And it just gave us 3 to 4 minutes where we were just able to speak to her and say, this is how amazing you are. And it didn't feel forced or fake, it was very genuine. And she could ask questions, and there was that dialogue, but she could see just how amazing she was, which oftentimes students have a hard time with that. We all have a hard time with that, right? But for a teenage girl to see that. And so that was cool. And that happens with, I would say, pretty much everybody at camp, all the students. At some point, you're just able to connect with them. And sometimes usually it's our leaders, but oftentimes because of the way the camp is structured, it can be a youth leader from New York or Montana that's also able to do that because they're also serving with our kids as well. And so it's just a cool thing, but that also means that there's spiritual warfare that happens oftentimes leading up to camp. And so be in prayer for the leaders, for the students, for their families, that everything's just going to go smoothly. Because that just makes for such a great experience. I think last year the worst thing that we had happen was a van, I won't say which one, went the wrong way on the highway for a little bit. So he went south for a while. We were supposed to go north. It was fine. He just wanted to he missed church. He missed you all. So in where we are with Hebrews, if you want, you can turn there to Hebrews 9. I got a lot of stuff done this week. We were preparing for camp. We were working on that stuff. And then every couple of years in my other job for training, I have to get certified. I need continuing education stuff. And so I've been working on that. So I did my test for that. And then, if you remember back in December, I got the front of my car hit. And so when they cleaned up the debris, they took away one of the license plates, and you need 2. And so right away when I saw that I was missing a license plate, I realized that when the fire department or whoever cleaned it up, they took one of my license plates away, and so I didn't have it anymore. So I'm like, Brad, do I really need 2 license plates? And Brad's like, yeah, you do. And so I went and I got a couple pair of license plates. But then when the repair shop put on the front of my car with the new license plate holder, they didn't put the screws with it that go in the license plate, right? And so I just need to go to Home Depot and pick up screws. But as I went to Home Depot, I realized, oh my gosh, there are a bajillion different types of screws and different lengths and all this. And so I bought what I thought I needed, but it didn't fit. And so of course I Googled it as well. And do they make one type of screw for license plates? No, they make like a bajillion different types of screws for license plates, right? And So I'm like, oh my gosh. So me and Aaron are there and we're trying to compare different things and it's frustrating. And we bought numerous kinds and they're all either too small or too big. And me and poor little boy, we're just looking and trying to figure out, okay, so what kind of screw do we need as we compare these different sizes? And that's frustrating enough. And when you start to think of it, though, that is kind of like a microcosm of life sometimes. Like we start comparing and looking at different things, and it seems like we have all these different options that are going on. And when we look at ourselves and everybody else and maybe our future as well, and we're like, man, like, what am I going to do or what am I going to choose? Because this might seem to fit here, but then we try it, it like doesn't seem to fit. And this one, we're like, that's definitely not going to work. And so we can live in a culture of comparison, and oftentimes it's inwardly, and we feel that sometimes it's outwardly. And we compare our lives to others or to their kids or to summer vacation plans or their homes or their cars and what they do, and we think, well, I'm not doing as well as they are, or I wish I could be as great as they are, or it might be nice to whatever. Maybe you compare your life now with where you thought you would be, and you're like, man, how come they're just not matching up, and what do I need to do, or what do I need to change? We compare, those that we went to school with, and so we see what they're doing on social media, and we're like, well, like that's pretty cool, or how come they get to do that, man, and we're happy for them. At the same time, it's kind of like, man, like maybe you feel a little bit stuck. And so comparison, it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because I would say it comes back to us being human and us being like we know that there's something better out there. We know that where we are now isn't everything. And so we know things aren't perfect. We know we're not at peace, and so we're constantly trying to get there. But where it becomes a problem is when it becomes almost cancerous and it overtakes us, and you find yourself comparing yourself to that person over and over again. Or maybe you keep having the same conversations in your mind with someone else, and they're not even real conversations. It's just what you're having in your mind over and over and over. And you keep looking for what's better, right? And so sometimes when comparison overtakes you, it stresses you out and it's frustrating. You're like, man, how come I just can't be at peace? Or how come I just can't get to where I want to be? And it can be rough. With the youth, we're going through a few weeks on mental health. This last Sunday night, we looked at the prophet Elijah. And we looked at the story where Elijah calls down fire from heaven. It's amazing. He sees a mighty act of God in his midst. And what happens next is Elijah runs for his life. And there's not the revival that he thought was probably going to happen. In fact, the queen's like, I want you dead. And so right after he sees an amazing act of God in his life, all of a sudden he finds himself in a place where he's running basically from God, and he's prays to God, like, just take my life. Like he just wants to be done. And after that is where he gets to the mountain, and that's the place, if you know the story, where God says to Elijah, like, what are you doing here, Elijah? Like, I created you to do something else, so why are you here? And then Elijah makes an excuse, and then God comes and asks him the same question again. He's like, Elijah, what are you doing here? And then Elijah gives him an excuse again, and then God's like, all right, Elijah, here's what you're going to do. Get up, go out, and I want you to continue to carry on. And then that's when he's going to meet Elisha. But things hadn't worked out quite in Elijah's life like how he planned that they were going to go. And so that comparison wrecked him emotionally, mentally, spiritually for a while. And while this letter to the Hebrews is written to an audience who was at that time comparing their options. Do I stay faithful to Christ, even though people are saying bad things about me and about Christians, and even though we're hated and persecuted by the empire and lied about? Do I stay faithful, or do I do what's easier? Do I go back to my Jewish ways, back to the synagogue with its laws and its priests? Or, if you weren't Jewish, do I go back to the earthly ways, the pagan ways of whatever gods they would serve? And as a quick recap, the author is telling his audience, like, stay faithful, because in the comparison game, like, Jesus is better. And so he's in a section where he's been talking about how Jesus is a better high priest. We looked at that over the last couple of weeks. And therefore, Jesus brought with him a better covenant. What's a covenant? It's an agreement. And so Jesus brought with him a better covenant, right? Because Moses had one and said, here were the laws, and you have to follow all these laws, and if you do that, you'll be right with God. But when Jesus came, he brought a better covenant and said, if you have faith in me and believe in me, my righteousness is credited to you. And therefore, that's how God sees you. And that's how you have eternal life. And so Jesus says, Jesus brought with him a better covenant and a better way. Because why would you need a new high priest to carry out an old covenant and an old way? And so today we're going to be in the first 10 verses of Hebrews 9. And then we're going to jump over to John. But in Hebrews 9:1, here's where he picks it up. Now the first covenant had regulations for worship and also an earthly sanctuary. A tabernacle, or a tent, was set up. In its first room were the lampstand and the table with its consecrated bread. This was called the holy place. And so he's mentioning this tabernacle again, and this is going to pop up again next week in the rest of the passage, but we looked at it a little bit last week as well. This whole part is going to be him saying the earthly tabernacle, the earthly tent, was a shadow of the reality of the one in heaven. And we talked about that last week. That's why the author spends so much time on the building of the tent in the Old Testament. And we read it, we're like, why do we need to know this? But the author of Hebrews is saying that's a shadow of the heavenly reality. And so that's why he spends so much time, because in the Old Testament, he's actually giving us glimpses into heaven. Behind the second curtain was a room called the Most Holy Place, which had the golden altar of incense and the gold-covered ark of the covenant. Now, if you stop there a second, so what does this all look like? Okay, well, again, you had the tent or the tabernacle, and around it you have all the people living in their tents, but you've got the court and you've got the tabernacle or the tent. All right, and then within the tabernacle, you've got the entrance, and there's the lampstand that he talked about, the bread, we have the altar of incense, and he talks like this is the first room. That's where he says that's the holy place. But then the most holy place, he says, is right here, and that's the Ark of the Covenant. Now, if you're reading the passage and you're like, but it said that the altar of incense was in the most holy place with that, that's a conundrum. And we don't really quite understand why he says it like that, but if I had to take a guess, if you look over in Revelation, you find that the altar represents the prayers of the righteous and the prayers of the martyrs. And so, like, it would have seeped into here, right? And it would have filled the whole room with that aroma, which in Revelation is prayers of the saints as well. But this is the presence of God to the Jewish people. It's the Holy of Holies. And how many people can go in there? One guy, once a year. Otherwise, it's off limits. If you go in there, you're probably going to die. And it's not going to be pretty. But that's essentially the most holy place. And that's where the author is saying this is a reflection of heaven. But he's like, but this is earthly. And so what we have in Christ is so much better. The ark contained the gold jar of manna. So within the Ark of the Covenant is the gold jar of manna, Aaron's staff that had budded, and the stone tablets of the covenant. Above the ark were the cherubim of glory, overshadowing the atonement cover. But we cannot discuss these things in details now. In other words, he's like, you know what, we're going to move on. But he says that there were three things in the ark. Manna. What did that symbolize? Why did they put that in there? Boom, God's provision, right? That he would provide for his people even in the wilderness. And when they had no other options, God was still going to be there to provide for them. When they had no other resources, God was still going to be there to provide for them. And then you have Aaron's staff. Well, Aaron's staff, that story is found in Numbers 17. And what you had before that was you had a rebellion by Korah. Some of you remember that story. I've heard of it. Korah's rebellion. Basically, people rise up against Moses and Aaron. They're like, you know what? We don't like the way that you're doing things. We want to do things our own way. And they get a lot of the nation to agree with them. And basically, they rebel against Moses and Aaron. And so God's like, okay, well, we're going to deal with that. And basically, ground opens up, swallows the rebellious, and then in number 17, you have God saying, all right, so here's what we're going to do so that there's no more questions about this. We're going to have all the elders of the tribes, they're going to take one staff, meaning it's not attached, meaning it can't grow anything, and we're going to have them write their name on it, and we're going to put them down, and one of them is going to sprout and have buds on it. And that's going to be the line of my priesthood. And so that's Aaron's staff. And so what it's signifying is that God's chosen line, his priesthood, is through Aaron. And so that's the staff. And then you have the tablets, right? The commands, God's ways. And so the picture here that he's painting is that when you're in the presence of God, in that Holy of Holies, you have his provision, you have his favor, and you have his ways. And if you're there, you can't go wrong with that. When everything had been arranged like this, the priests entered regularly into the outer room to carry on their ministry. But only the high priest entered the inner room, and that only once a year, and never without blood, which he offered for himself and for the sins of the people had committed in ignorance. And so the high priest was the only one who had the ability to access the Holy of Holies. Only once a year, and because he was a man and tainted with sin, he had to offer sacrifices. Again, what's the point of a sacrifice? Well, what's the penalty of sin? Death. And so, if I sin, therefore my penalty is death. Something has to die. It's supposed to be me. But a sacrifice, they would take an animal, they would lay their hands on it, and that would signify the animal was taking my place. And so my sin was essentially transferred to that animal, and he paid the price on my behalf. And so why bring this up? Well, Jesus is the better high priest, right? And was his access to God, to the presence of God, was his access restricted to just one time a year? No. Did he have to offer sacrifices for himself so he could be there? No. And so maybe you're like, Eric, we've covered this, haven't we? That's a good sign. That means you're getting to the point of Hebrews because the author really wants you to know this stuff. And so the author is saying in different ways so that his audience understands that Jesus is a better high priest. Jesus brought a better way. And if they want to go back to something else, they can, but it's going to be inferior. It's not going to be nearly as good because what they have is better. The Holy Spirit was showing by this that the way into the most holy place had not yet been disclosed as long as the first tabernacle was still functioning. This is an illustration for the present time, indicating that the gifts and sacrifices being offered were not able to clear the conscience of the worshiper. They're only a matter of food and drink and various ceremonial washings, external regulations applying until the time of the new order. And so here's the author's point. The earthly tabernacle, the earthly tent, because the high priest had to offer sacrifices, it was still incomplete. It wasn't the most perfect way. It was good, and it was effective for what it needed to accomplish at the time, but it wasn't the best. And he says, this is an illustration for the present time. Why would you want to give up on following Christ to return to that? Why would you want to give up on the grace and forgiveness of Christ to go back to something that didn't even clear the conscience? Because you can offer sacrifices, and the law helped people to get right with God and know what to do or what was sin or what was right. But none of that actually helped to clear their heart. And you know this because you can do some amazingly good things. And maybe you've won awards or had people praise you or love you, and you know you're loved. But yet, something happened in your past, and you still come back to that. And you almost allowed that to define you. Right? It still messes with your conscience. Because we're human. And we tend to remember the negative. But we have a different high priest who doesn't use the law as the means of saying how well we are and how good we're doing. Right? Our high priest in Jesus, his power is that he doesn't just intercede for us to God, but he also clears our conscience when we let him. And you know this as well, because sometimes you feel so close to God that no matter what you did in your past, you know that you're right with him. And it feels peaceful, it feels good, it feels like you can do anything in the world because your conscience is cleansed. And the author is like, so live there. That's your high priest. That's your Jesus. Stay with him. It doesn't make sense to go back to that. You see, there's a story in John 8, which I think kind of encapsulates this perfectly. And if you read it, it likely has a footnote in there that it's not in the earliest manuscripts of John. And so a lot of times it gets skipped over. But whether or not it was in the original manuscripts of John, or sorry, that's inserted, to me, when I read it, I get the sense that it happened. And whether or not it was part of John's manuscript or whether somebody, like it was written within the time period enough where people could have fact-checked it as well. And so you see the heart of Jesus in this story as our high priest. And so in the context of what we're talking about in Hebrews 9, it paints a picture exactly of what the author is getting at, in that in Jesus we have everything better than we had it before, or any other option that we could ever want. And so in 8:1 it goes, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn he appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group. So there's shame going on. And said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" And they were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. And so in this story, you have the law. And the law said that she should die. And if you're a Jewish person at this time, you would agree with them because the law was important. In the past, when Israel broke away from the law, that's when things went crazy. That's when Assyria came in. That's when Babylon came in, right? That's when they lost their country because they rejected the law. And so if you're a good Jewish person at that time, you're going to be like, let's follow the law. But these teachers of the law and the Pharisees, they think they know Jesus so well, and they think they know his character so well, that they figured he's going to offer grace, where the law said she deserved death. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. And with this one statement, he says, the ability to judge life and death depends on the righteousness of the one making the judgment. And I love it because Jesus, he's doing his thing, gets up, says one thing, right, and just goes back to what he's doing. It's almost like a drop the mic moment. Because he doesn't really, he's just like, it's not that hard. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time. The older ones first, and they would have held more sway, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. She's confronted with the Son of God himself. That high priest is the one right in front of her. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." And so the beauty in the story is that we see this woman who knew she was in a bad situation, and she had put herself there, and the law said that she had deserved death. She did not have a clear conscience. She was shamed. She was in the midst of a very bad situation where she was about to die, but Jesus, the great high priest, offers forgiveness. So where the law said death, Jesus said grace and peace with God. And then he also said, stop sinning. Sometimes we forget about that part. We're like, I'll take the grace and peace. But the author of Hebrews is like, that's the high priest, so why would you want to go back to the law? Why would you want to go back to death? Why would you want to go back to trying to do things on your own? Whether you're Jew or Gentile. It's like the option is set before you. The comparison isn't really that hard. If she received grace for what she did when she deserved death, whatever you have in your life, that same Jesus is your great high priest as well. And so while you might compare yourself to the things that you've done, or that you're not where you thought you'd be, it's like you don't have to live that way anymore, and you don't have to live in comparison because you already have what's better. Right? You can compare where you're going to go eat after church today. Or you can compare, staying at your job now or going to a different one. You can compare where to go on vacation. Your faith, your Christ, that's not even up for comparison. It's already the better way. And you already have what's better. And so if you're currently wrestling with how come not where I want to be, or how come they seem to have it so much easier while I struggle, if you're comparing your family or your spouse or your kids or your income or your car or what looks like your future is going to look like or your paycheck, just stop all of it because you don't have to compare anymore. You already have what's best. And if you'll live wherever you are right now with your great high priest, your future is good enough. Keep following him. Keep staying focused on him, the very one who, when you screw it up, stands in front of you like you did that lady, and he says, I forgive you. You have my righteousness, grace and peace. You don't need anything else. Right? Anything else is going to start to be where we get our identity from. And the author of Hebrews is like, get your identity from Jesus. Because if Jesus is for you, and he's in the presence of the Father right now, interceding for you, which as we looked about a couple weeks ago, Hebrews 7:24, because Jesus lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood. Because Jesus lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood. Therefore, he's able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. So Jesus is living right now in the presence of God as a high priest to intercede for you. What can be better than that? And what more could you want? Let's pray. God, we oftentimes don't realize that Christ is standing in the presence of the Father, and he lives to intercede for us. And so we don't realize that oftentimes we already have what's better and the most perfect option available. We look at the things of the world, we get distracted with the things of the world, and we get so focused on those that we don't look up. But when we do, we realize that no matter where we are, because we have you, we already have what's best. And we know that in your presence, we have your provision, we have your favor, we have your ways. So help us to stay in your presence. Help us to continue to choose what's better, which is Christ. And we know it can be hard. We know we get distracted easily. We know we like shiny things. And so we ask that you would consume our minds and our hearts. Help us to do that, especially when we don't realize that we need it. Help our spirit to lead us there. And so we thank you for loving us. And we ask that you would pull us back into your grace and your presence when we need it. Sometimes forcefully, sometimes gently, whatever we need at the time. Just help us to realize that we already have what's better and what's best and what's perfect. In Christ's name, amen.